Welcome to the Advancement Podcast. This is Taylor Schote with Tim Ware, the president of Advancement Coaching and Consulting. Today, we will be discussing practical insights for pastors and church leaders to advance your life, your work, and your ministry. Are you ready to advance? Welcome back to the Advancement Podcast with Tim Ware and our guest on the show today, Chad and Joe and myself. We've been talking about family matters, and this episode, we're going to get into the grieving process, being a leader and working through your grief and trying to lead others in their times of needs as well. The last episode, we talked about some of the struggles or personal journeys that the three of us have gone through, Chad and Joe and myself, and looking forward to getting into some more of how we were strong leaders dealing with the struggles that we were going through. So, Tim, thanks for having us back.
Yeah, and everybody who can see it and isn't just listening, I'm still having lighting issues, and Marco's still going to be very frustrated when he sees this. And sorry, Marco. I guess this is why I need a producer, huh? I'm not able to produce myself. Are you guys there?
Yeah.
Okay, because I'm looking at the screen and everybody's still, and I thought, did the internet freeze? Did the internet freeze up? Oh, no. I went to a place where it's supposed to be stable.
No, we're here with you, Tim.
And just a note, Taylor's going old school because his wireless earbuds, the batteries died.
Yeah, they gave me a hard time about being the young. At one time I was considered too old, and now I was considered too young. And I'm just trying to find the happy medium. Just trying to, if it helps you guys, I don't have the noise canceling turned on these.
Look, all of y'all are in your 30s, and we're not going to talk about how old I am. So we're just going to
not all.
We're just leave it all alone, okay? So let's just talk right now. Let's get into this. The idea, sometimes, guys, when you're walking through things in ministry, what's going on at home affects you as a leader. And when, with each of you being diagnosed with polycystic, and Taylor, y'all struggling with and even Joe, y'all struggling with the infertility piece, and Chad, when getting this diagnosis and struggling in the pregnancy, just all these things, when there's grief in your life and you have to go home and lead in the church at the same time, when there's a toll that it takes grieving, and yet somehow we're supposed to come into the office, we're supposed to get in the pulpit, supposed to spend the time focusing on developing a sermon with this weight on us. And so what I'd really like you guys to take, let's just get into an open dialogue about what it means and how you lead when you're walking through a personal grieving process, and you have a responsibility of leading your people and leading your church at the same time. Go.
It's tough. It's difficult. I think that, we do what we do because we feel called by God. We do what we do because there's something more than, there's something supernatural that's brought us to this point. So that said, when we're dealing with the stuff that's going on in our lives, especially when it's very raw, it's very real, very, very personal and deep, it's tough to battle through that. It's tough to try to lead when you're limping along. And I think these guys would agree with me.
Yeah, I would tell you that it's one of the biggest challenges is trying to allow space for grief at home and in front of your spouse, and with not just in front of, but with your spouse, giving permission for them to grieve, you grieving as well as a couple, and then Sunday morning and other days of the week showing up and putting on your A game. That was one of the biggest challenges I think we faced in our journey, aside from the personal aspect of it as a leader, wanting to be both authentic and to be solid, to present a solid front was definitely a challenge. But
I think the challenge part is, so I think everybody listening would say, yeah, it's hard. I think the real question that we need to answer is, how do you, what are the steps you took to, using your language, Taylor, what are the steps you take when you're in the middle of grief to put on your A game when you're with people, so that you're not dragging them into your world and dragging them down, but how do you put on your A game when you're in the middle of it?
You know, Morgan and I, we served together at a church where I remember our pastor, when we first got there, he told us something we struggled with for a while, but then when we got into this journey, it made a little bit more sense. It's going to sound a little bit raw. We took it a little raw when we heard it. He said, hey guys, when you come and you show up on Sundays, you're not allowed. He said, I don't allow you to say you had a hard week, because everyone has hard weeks. And I don't want your struggle of whatever you're going through to be a burden on someone else. And in the moment, we didn't like it. It didn't feel real. To be totally honest with you, I don't know that that's the best way to phrase it. But when we got in the middle of our journey, what we realized is we didn't want to drag people down with us. We needed their support. They needed us. They needed our leadership. They needed our strength and encouragement. And so the steps we took were, we continually reminded ourselves that Jesus had us, and that we were going to give it to Jesus. And at times, we would say at home, we would try to take some on of ourselves. We would discuss it and we would talk about it. We would be real with it in front of people. We didn't ever want to not be real, but at the same time, we wanted them to know, hey, guys, we're in the middle of a journey just like you are, and we're trusting the Lord with you. Where when you bring us your struggle, we've got struggle, and we're going to trust the Lord together. So it was this balance. I don't know that I've really listed some steps here, but as much as holding in our hands this balance of, we're not going to lay our burden at your feet because you can't handle it. Right. We're going to give that to Jesus. And what it did is it freed us to be leaders.
I would say to what Taylor's saying is that there's a difference in ministry being transparent and being vulnerable. So it's obvious if people in the congregation know, for instance, with Taylor, if he and his wife, there were infertility issues. People weren't ignorant to the fact that Joe was struggling, or the fact that they know simply by seeing my daughter every time she eats that there's insulin shots going in, or she wears a device on her arm to account for what her glucose or blood sugar is. But I think there's a difference between being transparent and vulnerable. And the vulnerability happens between you and your wife, your family, those very, very private moments. And I think over time you can allow people into those areas. But the transparency of saying, hey, there's something that's going on. So I kind of agree to what Taylor's pastor said, but again, maybe trying to soften that a little bit, and just that you need to be transparent. But when you stand in front of people, there's a difference between being completely transparent and being, vulnerable. And if we always operate in that vulnerability, I think that's where it can drag people down.
Well, there's also a definite line between wanting not to appear weak in front of people, and especially with some of the things that I went through, where there were days when I just had a tough time getting out of bed. I had a tough time standing in the pulpit, and wanting to put on this appearance of strength so that I didn't appear weak. And my case may be unique because I was coming into a new pastorate at a new church, and I didn't want to give off this appearance that I was weak. And that plays with your mind too. I mean, it messes with you a little bit, because you're constantly thinking about the way someone else is seeing you. There's a fine line between not wanting to appear weak, but then not being real. And so you have to balance the two of being, how do I be real and be authentic, and yet still not dwell in the difficulties that I'm facing, and not make it to where other people don't see any victory in my life.
Well, I think, authenticity, I can't remember who said it recently, but they said authenticity is the new currency. And, the reality is being authentic is a high value, especially when we're trying to reach and communicate the gospel to people. So this differentiation between vulnerability and, instead of using the word transparency, I think what I wrote in my notes was being authentic. That's a great delineation that we can learn to protect those things. And what I wrote down was protect your vulnerable moments while being authentic.
Yeah. Tim, one of the things, each of our stories are unique within themselves. And so our listeners may attach themselves to one story more than the other. And I would say one thing that Morgan and I did was, because though the infertility was affecting me, I wanted to have a child just as much. Morgan was struggling with it, I think probably a little bit more. She's the one who would tell you she felt called to be a mom. And I just went to my pastor, as I'm an associate pastor, and I just went to he and his wife and said, "Hey, I'm going to need extra grace in this season. Sometimes that's going to mean I may need to be with my wife. We may have an event going on, and she's going to need me at home to be an encouragement to her. Or that may mean she may not show up to some of these things. Like, we're going to be involved as much as we can. We're going to try our best to put on but if we're having a tough day, we need to know that there's grace to have a tough day." And so for her, that meant sometimes she didn't come to every service because she couldn't be in front of, one thing I remember during all this is when you share, and we felt like that's what God told us to do, was to share with the people, and now on the back end of it, we know why. That it's like I said in the last podcast, that Matilda, our baby, is a miracle, not just for us, but that's supposed to be shared. But every Sunday, every event, people were coming up, and it was like when we had settled it before we got to the event or before we got to church, they would bring it back up. So there were just times we had to gauge our own temperature, our own capacity in the moment. Can we go in and deal with this with people? And I just think that as pastors that are listening, and I'll tell you, that was the biggest blessing in the journey for my pastor, was they gave a lot of grace to know when we could be present and to know when we needed to be absent.
So I hear two things in this. If you have subordinate staff and leaders, you need to make sure that there are moments where you need to extend grace.
Yes.
But I also think I hear that you have to be willing to receive grace. There has to be a humility piece in this journey.
Yeah, listen,
because even like Joe talking about when he didn't want to be in the pulpit, and people are, there has to be moments where, okay, I don't need to be here, right?
Yeah.
Go ahead, Taylor.
I was going to just follow up that if you know me, especially if you know me from my youthfulness, I kind of have this suck it up mentality. If the job requires you to be there at this time, you have no excuse not to be there at that time. And if you got to be on, I use that phrase. If it's requiring your A game, then you got to bring it. And so it was hard for me to have to go, and it was humbling, and at times it felt humiliating, but I know the Lord was teaching me in it, that I just needed to ask, hey, Pastor David, Pastor Michelle, I need it. My wife needs it. My family needs it. And that was hard, but in it now, I'm more self-aware. I'm far more self-aware of when I need those times. So yeah, receiving grace is just as hard as giving it, I think.
Because, in grief, they say the stages of grief that you begin with this denial piece, that you move from denial and isolation to wanting to be alone to anger, and then through these bargaining and depression and to the point of acceptance. Once you get on the backside of it, but in those early stages where you're wrestling with, I can't believe this is true, and I don't want to talk to anybody, and you're dealing with that anger piece and moving through that, moving through those stages, also there's the way you lead people. If you just start with the beginning, I don't want to be with you, and you have to put yourself out there when you don't want to be there at all.
What's difficult is when you physically feel bad and you don't want to be there, or you're facing something very heavy, it's all that much more difficult. And in my case, for instance, I would put it all into my preaching, and then I would have to leave the back of the platform, and I would get calls on Monday of people's hands I didn't shake, and they would be frustrated or upset with me. Part of that was I wasn't sharing the journey with anybody. And a lot of people didn't know what I was facing. First-time visitors coming in just thought that it was kind of off-putting to them that I would preach and then leave out of the back of the platform in a smaller church. And so that can be difficult sometimes to force yourself to do things that you don't want to do. And I think part of that is doing it in a way that makes more sense. And the way that you set it up and the way that you allow people to walk through that journey with you and bring aliside of you, I think makes a huge difference. And for me, I didn't recognize or realize that I was grieving through that process. I didn't realize that because I'm the type, similar to Taylor, where I'm just going to push through no matter what. I don't care what I feel. 2 weeks after my kidney transplant, I preached Easter Sunday. And it was the hardest thing I've ever done in my life. But sometimes you just make yourself do things, even probably shouldn't. Sometimes make yourself do those things. And part of it is allowing people to share that journey with you and preparing people better to receive that. And I think people will offer grace. I think generally want to offer grace. But if they don't know, then they don't know that they should.
Joe, if you could go back, Joe, if you could go back to that moment, would you have still, where you are now, would you have still preached that 2 weeks after your surgery?
Because I'm the person that I am, I think I would still feel like I had to, even though I recognize and realize that somebody could do it just as well as I could. I just don't think there's any way I could ever.
Let's ask the question a different. Let's ask the question a different way.
Should I not would be the question.
Should I? That's the question I want to know.
Well,
yeah. And the question is, I probably should not have. And I mean, you can go back on our website or our app and you can watch the service. And I sat down through the service, and it's not like I didn't, I threw the net out and I did all the right things. It's not like I didn't do that. But it does send a picture when you do that there is a lack of trust with people and those kinds of things. This is me being too vulnerable.
Well, I think what we feel in ministry is that we're supposed to be superheroes, and depending on the church culture that you're in or that you grew up in,
weakness either.
Depending on the church culture that you grew up in, the generation, the pastor never stood on the platform and talked about his weakness, never shared them in a sermon, never talked about, hey, what was going on in his life. So then we feel this pull to be a superhero, and kind of could piggyback off what Taylor was saying. It was really not him being a superhero, but it was supernatural for him to recognize that what he had to do was to go and to say, hey, I need to pull back in this season. I may need to pull back, and I may need to be with my wife. I may need to, and so instead of trying to always push and I'm going to be the superhero and I'm going to do it because doggone it, no one else can, to be able to say, let me operate in that supernatural grace to allow
those
other
moments
people to lead.
Those moments are really important. And honestly, that's the dichotomy that most pastors face.
Absolutely.
Which is, I don't want to appear weak, and yet I realize and recognize that I have to take care of me, or I'm not going to be able to do long-term the things that God wants me to do. And so balancing those things is tough. And especially when you're leading a church, you're leading a group of people, it becomes really difficult because you certainly don't want to give the board any apprehension that you might not be able to make it. And so every time you go into a board meeting, every time you stand up in the pulpit, you appear as strong as possible. And you don't ever tell anybody, and I just didn't sleep last night, or I was in pain all night, or I've been feeling bad all day. You show up to the office, you do all the things you have to do. And so, and I think a lot of pastors are probably like that, especially some that are facing chronic issues where they're facing and having a tough time balancing the way that I physically feel, being sometimes unable to accomplish the things that I need to do. And because they don't want to be, and at the same time, not wanting to be real with people because they're afraid of the consequences of doing so. And that's a real thing that most pastors face.
I think there is a unique component that you just raised, is the chronic piece, because whether it be infertility and, well, if we can't have a baby, we can go adopt, we can start a family some way. There, you end up coming to a place where there are other options with the child illness that's going to be with you forever. But but this really is with Caitlin's illness and what you were facing, Joe. If you hadn't received a transplant, this could have been a lifestyle. And there's a chronic piece that just lags and drags out, I do think that there's a little bit of difference in recognizing that. But listening to you guys talk, I don't think that it necessarily, from this side, hearing it doesn't shift the fact that I still need to be authentic, figure out how to be authentic.
Yeah.
But I really appreciated what you said, is that when we don't allow others to help us, that's a pride issue, and it displays a lack of trust in them.
Yeah. Tim, as I was listening to both Chad and Joe, the thought kind of came to me is, I struggle with this myself, that I equate leadership and strength as the same thing. I go, to be a good leader is to be a strong leader, to be a leader who's always on point, who's always capable, who's always, this never can be weak moment. And there's a couple of things, even personally that I'm convicted by, that having those thoughts of, number one, what is that showing my people, what those that are following me? If they know, like for us, they knew, we shared that with them. They knew if they didn't see the struggle, does that communicate something to the people that are following and building their belief system, not on us, but by also watching us, the influence that we have in them, and just realizing that there is such a need as leaders to be self-aware. And then so that was kind of one thought, maybe jumbled there. But then the other thought kind of hit me too, that all of us, I think in the first episode, talked about knowing that God had us, knowing that God was going to do something. We might not have seen it in the moment, but we wrestled with the idea that God was going to do something, or He's capable of it. And I think we have to take that a step further in these moments as leaders and say, if God has got us, then He's also big enough to have the ministry. He's big enough to care for the people. He's big enough to give grace. That was something, I didn't know walking into my pastor's office, whether or not I would get grace, because I'm again, very much hey, this is ministry and I do it because it's ministry, but also realize there's a job component to it. I'm not going to continue to get paid if I don't show up and perform some duties here. And so I needed to trust that God was going to give those whom I needed grace from the grace that I needed.
And on the flip side of the coin, also, I will just say quickly that we do have to be cautious that we don't dwell in those difficulties. Again, like Taylor said in the last part, everybody faces these things. Everybody goes through certain things. And the caution is also that making sure that you are being authentic, but that you're not dwelling on these things constantly. It's one thing to get up and to speak to your people about, this is what I'm facing, this is what I'm going through. It's another thing to make every message about it, and every conversation.
You can't live in a pity party.
Turn in that direction.
You can't live in a pity party. Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, because the danger of what could happen is it could feel like for us, it could have felt like the entire church was struggling with infertility, if that's what we did, or the entire church struggling with whatever it is that we're struggling with. And And I don't know that that's healthy.
I appreciate one of the things that you said there. One of the things that happens in ministry is that, and when you, having worked with hundreds of pastors, we talk about, the phrase is right, wrong, and different is, well, this is, at my church, in my ministry. And there is a reality that, that's really sounds like it becomes important in this moment when grief is heavy, to say this is actually God's ministry and he's letting me participate with him, and I really have to trust him in this moment.
Yeah.
As a leader.
And sometimes a lot of those things happen when nobody else is around, and you are feeling down, and you're feeling like no one hears me, nobody knows what I'm going through, those kinds of things. And then you're reminded of the hand of God that moves through your circumstance and that is with you and helping you and encouraging you. And for me, it was Isaiah 43:4. He said, I'll give men for your life and people for you. And quite honestly, Tim, you were one of those people that the Lord put in my life. I've said it, the process is the plan, and had no idea the direction that the Lord was going to take my life. And yet he reminded me that I will give people for your life. I will put people around you who can bless you. And I had no idea when my nephrologist started meeting with me and telling me I was going to have a kidney transplant, going to have to go on dialysis. He told me, he said, certainly you have a bunch of people that want to give you a kidney. And I said, I don't have anybody. He said, well, aren't you a pastor of a church? I said, yes. He said, well, why don't you just get up on Sunday and tell people that you need a kidney? I said, I think that's kind of like abusing my office. Or I'm not going to do that. I can't imagine preaching a message about giving.
I need your kidney. We're taking up an offering. Who's got a kidney to give?
Hey,
I can't imagine.
Next week, I want to come and just say, I just need some money.
Right, exactly. And I said, no, I don't have anybody. He said, well, and then what are you going to have to do? I said, well, I'm going to trust God is what I'm going to do, because long before I knew, God knew that Tim was going to give me a kidney long before I was even born. And the Lord had set the process up already long before Tim knew, long before anybody knew. And I have to be reminded of that this is the plan of God. It's the hand of God. And when I get frustrated or I get aggravated, sometimes I want to throw the pity party. And yet God always, quite honestly, Tim, I hate, but God always brings you to my mind when I start thinking things like that. And he says there was somebody willing to give this to you, and it's a good reminder.
Also, Joe's a lot. Joe, I've got that hyperactive piece, so he also uses me an excuse anytime he has that moment. That's just Tim. That's just the Tim part of me.
My new ADHD is Tim.
Thank God, Tim was born 15 years before you, Joe, so that God was preparing the way before you ever.
15. I thought it was like 25.
Whoa! All right, we're coming to the end of our time with this conversation. We're going to come back next time and look at how we pray for people in faith and lead in and have faith for others when we're still needing exercising so much faith for ourselves, and we're going to have that part of the conversation. But here's some keys I heard when we're walking through the grieving and the weight. I heard that I think were keys. It was I really love the phrase, the wordsmithing you did. Protect the vulnerable moments while remaining authentic and transparent. I think it's important. I love that we said we have to extend grace and receive grace. We have to trust that those people that God's put around us. We need to be self-aware. And Taylor, I love the fact that you said we have to realize that leadership and strength aren't the same thing. That I can be a leader while in the midst of my weakness.
Yeah.
Which points us to the fact that the truth is all of this is God's ministry, and if we remember that, it's His ministry, and He's on the journey with us. It's good stuff. Chad, we're going to roll to you. Hey, so I'm going to just play our game. What's your takeaway from this conversation the last 25 minutes or so?
Yeah, I would say I think the part that I really that speaks to me, even where I'm sitting today, is that the whole grace component, that that we expect grace from others. We don't always extend grace to ourselves, and making sure that it's an extending grace in whatever it is. That again, I don't have to be a superhero, and when I extend grace to others, or I extend grace to myself, that's operating in the supernatural, because that's not the normal thing. So to make sure that in everything I do, I'm extending grace, particularly to myself.
That's good stuff. Well, guys, we'll be back. We'll see you next time on the Advancement Podcast as we continue this series on family matters and leading our churches when things are difficult at home, when there's difficulties in our lives. Don't forget that we're going to be making some changes. We're going to be doing some new things, some fresh things at the first of the year. So you'll want to subscribe and check out the podcast in January. And also want you to start looking for looking for notifications for the seminar that'll be coming up also after the first of the year in partnership with the Remnant Radio. We love you guys. Check you out next time on the Advancement Podcast.
Thank you for joining us today on the Advancement Podcast. The show notes are available on our website at www.advancement.cc, along with other resources. Again, this is Taylor Schode on behalf of Tim Ware and the entire Advancement team. We want you to remember that you are meant to advance.